So we've got kids who are just living on sheer willpower. They start really, really strong, determined. Nothing is going to fall through the cracks. I'm going to crush it. And then they just can't keep up that level of engagement. And then things start to fall apart. We got the roller coaster kids who procrastinate a lot. They pull it all together with a long all-nighter, but then they got to recover from having done the all-nighter, and then they end up procrastinating, and then the cycle repeats. We've got kids who have really low engagement, and every time they seem to try, it just gets worse. And so they're like, what's even the point? We have kids who are facing derailment. Something else has just knocked them off course. Maybe they were sick. Maybe they got injured in a sports activity. Maybe, something else in their personal life is going on or in their family life is going on. And it just takes their focus off of school and they get really derailed. And then we have perfectionist students who exhibit a lot of anxiety and heightened stress. They overstudy, they're doing the most, even if it is not necessary to prepare for whatever is happening the next day. All of these things are related to executive function. So I see a lot of roller coasters. We got, social media, drama, derailing students. I know I have more than 3 or 4 parents in the audience. So I want to hear a little bit more from some other folks. What are you seeing with your kid? Do any of these resonate with you, or is it something totally different? Oh, A and B. Oh yeah, that's a difficult combination. Okay. More roller coasters, lots of I forgot. Okay. Yeah. All right. This is all very familiar. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this, beyond just, knowing who's in the room, I want you all to know you're not alone. I think one of the things, I mean, Andrea will talk about this for sure. One of the things that affects the parents of these kids is a real sense of shame that you got to kind of hide it. And that doesn't help anybody, right? It's not helping you, it's not helping your kid. So I want you to know you're not alone. These are all very, very common. And we've seen worse. So don't feel shy to ask for help or to talk to other people about these issues because that's how you get help and that's how things get better. All right. So, what is going on in all of these situations? As I mentioned, these are all sort of related to executive functions. And those executive functions are higher order brain processes that just help us get things done, right? So, and they range. There's time management skills, impulse control, setting priorities, emotional regulation, future planning, breaking big things down into smaller pieces, even just getting started is part of this umbrella of skills and these skills grow with your experience, so it's not like you're born with them, but different people do learn these skills at different rates and at different times in their lives, and we all hit learning curves, right? And a lot of those learning curves happen at big times of transition. So it might be we're going from summer into the school year, or it might be we're going from middle school into high school, or we're ramping up from 10th grade where things felt manageable to 11th grade where now everybody's talking about college and the SAT and like all of these other things, right? Or maybe at some point in their high school career, they start to get interested in dating, and that just throws a wrench in everything, right? And that can stress some of these skills that had been serving them up until that point, right? But now they've kind of got to level up a little bit on these skills so that they can handle whatever's in front of them. And while these executive functions seem like, okay, they're just really basic, they seem more related to like day-to-day life. Can you like get up in the morning and feed yourself and whatever? These are foundational to academic success. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And of course, um, academic success is a big part of the college application, but getting the test score if you need it, managing the college application process with the, tens, sometimes 20s, 30 essays that students have to write. These are really complex goals with lots of moving pieces and a long, sometimes confusing timeline. So those executive function skills are going to be really essential to not just getting into college, but getting through the process of applying. So, whatever grade your student is in, now is the time to work on these things. It's never too late. So we'll go back to kind of our initial starting point of like what's going on. And I like to use this metaphor of a bicycle because, especially with a multi-speed bike, you got to be in the right gear, right? And you really need to make sure that gear is calibrated to your own abilities and your endurance, right? And so different aspects of that kind of play into all of these things. There are strong start, weak finish students. That gear is just too high and they can't keep going for very long at that high level. The roller coaster is they're never quite calibrated. They may be going too high or too low, but it's never quite right for the situation in front of them. And so it ends up being this roller coaster. Our low to low engagement, lower engagement is this gear is like way too high, so much so they can't even move it, right? And the effort that they're exerting is tiring them out, and the thing is still not moving. So yeah, we're giving up. We're walking away from this bicycle. Derailment. This happens to me a lot when I bike. Somehow my chain falls off, and then that takes a different process of getting back into the gear that you need to be in, right? You got to pull over, you got to put the chain back on, you've got to start at a low gear and slowly move up, right? So depending on the situation, you might have to do something a little bit different to kind of recover. And then our perfectionist students, that gear is too low and all that pedaling is not moving them forward. It's not connecting to the grade that they want, or maybe they already have, and they just feel like they need to keep going and keep pedaling because they're so worried that they're gonna, lose it somehow. So think about that and how it applies to your student. And then we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about this from a different angle. And I'm going to actually, no, I have one more slide and then I'm going to let Andrea talk. Sorry about that. But as I mentioned before, especially for the parents in the room, college might be looming, right? It may not be the thing that's happening right now. You may not be in the college application process right now. You might have a senior. But even if you have a seventh or eighth grader, I know that parents are worried about what does this look like in the long term, right? So you see something that your kid is doing, maybe they do their homework, but they forget to turn it in, or they don't realize something's due, or they know that something's due, but they procrastinate until the very last minute. And you're like, oh my God, it's so obvious what's going on here and what the solution in. And you are just like, you can see it so clearly. You want it fixed already, yesterday even, right? And you feel like this should be easy. But if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, how are we really going to get to college? I want you to remember, like, perfection is not what colleges are looking for. It's never too late to start building these skills with your kids. And the way meaningful, lasting change happens is what you see here in this diagram. I want to spend just a second on it. This is uh, a child developmental psychologist, Prochaska, came up with this model like in the 80s. And as far as I know, no one's really improved upon it. It's a very useful model, right? And you can see that we sort of start here and we go around this circle, and there's meant to be an upward spiral, right? And this, I think, is a much more realistic picture of how change actually happens, right? There's a behavior, and then maybe they're aware that a problem exists, but they're not ready to change. Then we start thinking about, oh yeah, maybe I should make some changes. Then we actually make the change, and then they've got to sustain that change in their behavior. And inevitably, there's going to be something that causes a relapse, but they've learned from going through this pathway that they're not starting back at zero. This is like, an upward trajectory on this thing. And as I was putting this diagram on the slide, I was thinking through how I want to share it with you. And what I would really love you to do, and I'll tell you why in a second, what I would really love you to do is locate your child on this map, right? Think about the problem that you want solved and where are they in terms of solving that problem on the road to solving that problem. I was putting this together and I was thinking about my father who recently moved in with me. And there are so many things that I'm like, oh my God, can you please just take care of yourself? This is so obvious to me. But when I had to sit and look at this map, it brought me a sense of compassion, a sense of understanding, and a whole lot more patience, right? And even some hope, right? He's not in this stage. He's maybe down here, right? I wish he were over here, but he's over here. And I'm like, oh, well, that's so much better than being there. And I know what I can expect next, right? I know we're getting close, right? So take a second and just think about that. I hope it brings you some peace and some compassion for your student as well. But we want to keep this in mind as we think about how do we shift behaviors, because we can't force them to move from here to here, right? They've got to go through this process. And we can help create the conditions for them to move through this process, right? And Andrea now is going to talk to us a little bit about.
Before you change slides,
Oh, yeah.
what I love about this diagram is that it allows us to expect that a relapse is going to happen, a backslide is going to happen. It's part of our process. So it helps parents, not freak out, right? If they're feeling that maybe things are backsliding a little bit, it helps reduce shame on children if we can say, okay, this is part of our work together. You're doing great. I know it. Something's going to come up and we're going to backslide and then we're going to do it all again. And that's normal. So I love just the way that kind of normalizes that. It's not you're here and then you're over here. You're all around, all through life. I'm sure we can all think about our own lives in that way.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, now I'm good. You can go to the slides.
All right, thank you.
So this slide always I make myself laugh a little bit because it's something I open with my students usually when I see them for the first time at various parts in that upward spiral there. That I'm hearing the word should. I should, I shouldn't, I know I should, my dad said I should, my mom said I should, I know that I should, blah, 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 blah. And my kind of first step here is to say, okay, I say, depending on the age of the student, we're shooting all over the place, people. This is not a productive place for us to start from. The first place is to kind of recognize that all of this is very emotional. Sheila, in your presentation so far, we've been talking about executive functions, but I've heard you talk a lot about emotions, right? We're talking about anxiety, stress, panic, hope was the last one you mentioned, right? Realizing that that's the place we're starting from. We've got a lot of emotions going on. Those emotions often for students in these cases turn directly into shame. And the first time they sit across from me, they are starting from that shame place. Movement through that spiral cannot happen easily if we're not at least understanding and addressing that that's where we're at the moment. So I like to kind of open with this to say that is probably how a lot of you are communicating to your students or how they are communicating with you, what the problems are. Encouraging you to try to get that word should out of your behavior and even out of your mind. I should as a parent, I shouldn't as a parent. Because not only is it a shame-based place to start, it assumes there's only one right answer. And why can't we all do this thing? It's so clear there's one clear right answer, right? There might not be. Should puts everybody in a box. It doesn't consider context, other things that are happening in a student's life. You mentioned, a big illness or an injury, right? That student might be saying, I should be better by now. Doesn't really take into consideration their context. And depending on, honestly, the culture and the zeitgeist and the marketing that we're exposed to, this answer is always going to change based on who you talk to and what's going on in the world. And at one point I did add this last bullet point that says it sells you things. It's like a way that marketers can get you on the hook, right? If only you download this expensive monday.com software, whatever the heck it is that day, right? You should just download this and all your problems will be solved. Not the case. You should run everything through an AI and get an AI assistant. Probably not the case, but that's what people are going to use to sell you things. So starting from that understanding, Sheila, if you could be so kind, I like to reframe it that instead of starting from should, starting from all this external noise we hear out there, how can we empower students to start from themselves, to build that own self-understanding and reflection, really? That is like the first step of pulling out of that pre-contemplation, right? Starting to say, oh, I'm kind of looking within and I'm recognizing there's a problem here. To get away from that shame feeling, I like to remind students that like Sheila, you opened with, like habits on their own are not bad. They just serve a purpose, right? The habits you've been doing until this point have served some purpose, but now we've got a different purpose that we're dealing with, or we want to put our focus somewhere else. I think a lot sometimes about an example of a student who might be kind of phoning it in a math class. They're coasting, they're not really studying, they might have some aptitude, but they're just like not really trying very hard. And parents are saying, well, why? You could have gotten into honors math, you could have gotten into AP. Like, why are you stuck in this habit of like not caring in math? Well, what that has gotten that student up until this point is being the big fish in the small pond. And that is way easier than being the small fish in the big pond, right? So if we're able to start to think about the context and the reasons and what these habits have gotten students up until this point, which may be lower expectations and less pressure for a lot of kids, that can start helping us open up dialogues and move things along. I also reassure students that if it were as easy as just doing it, right? Like Sheila, when you're thinking about your dad, like, why won't he just do this thing? He would have done it already, right? It's much more deep and much more layered than maybe it feels and it looks on the surface. So that's why the self-reflection is the first place to start. And I encourage students really to think about what is their actual pain point, right? Are you, if you took shame out of the equation, would everything be okay? Right? Sometimes, I'm thinking of an example where parents and students fight a lot about like student does homework really late at night and the parents are like, they shouldn't do their homework late at night. That's bad. And we do some uncovering of like, why? Like, why is it bad? And for some students, like, we want to consider all like, are they getting enough sleep? Are they rested? Are they stressed? That sort of thing. But if that's just really what works for the students and the conflict is the shame and the should, if we just take that off, so like they're already pedaling this bike, we don't need to put a bunch of bricks in their basket, right? Can we empty the basket and see how the bike runs? I like to even just introduce that as an idea, right? How do things get better if we let go of how our image of how we think things should work? So, that's that final question. Do they want to change habits or they just think that they should? Which is an interesting question. You can continue, Sheila. This is my like favorite slide on here. I feel like when I found this, it like blew my mind a little bit. Because it's not a concept I didn't encounter, but it put some words to some things. So I want to introduce the idea of different ways that students and people find motivation. I imagine just looking even in the chat so far, a lot of what we're coming down to is I just can't get my kid to execute and do the thing they need to do. I found this description of how motivation can come from different places, and a lot of folks are going to either be motivated by importance or they're going to be motivated by novelty. When we think about like the classic, just like, I don't know, like puritanical way of thinking about motivation, I think we're thinking about importance, right? It's tied to rewards and consequences. It means pleasing an external figure like a teacher or a parent, where it's like something that's important to you. It meets some important goal. And for many students who, may not have as much trouble with executive functioning, or I'd say the students who have high anxiety, which ends up getting in their way, importance is enough for them to be like, oh, I have to do this thing, right? For some folks in other brains, novelty is the thing that gets them to do work, right? So it's not enough that the thing is important. It has to have this other sort of element to it. This acronym PINCH I found in some research, which breaks down into like, what does novelty even mean? It can look like it's playful, it's fun, it's a game. It's interesting, it's inherently fascinating to the student, it gets all their attention. It's a completely new thing or done something in a completely new way. There's competition, there's a challenge, maybe there's a peer, they're like, trying to get a higher score than in school. That can be really exciting. But for most people, and I think this is what unlocks a lot of our understanding about procrastination, is like oh, the adrenaline's on. It's in a hurry. It is happening now. So your students who are maybe more inclined to be motivated by novelty, they all end up falling into the H, right? They're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting. But ooh, once that the excitement, even if it is negative, right? It turns the nervous system on. There's lots of activity. We know it's crunch time. Then they're able to execute and begin, right? And I think there's a lot of conflict between parents and students when they're seeing, oh, my student's not motivated, they're not getting the work done, so they must not believe that it's important. And how frustrating is that as a parent, right? You're like, obviously this thing is important. Why don't they understand it's important? They might, but that just might not be enough for them to, turn the engine over, right? We'll switch from a bicycle metaphor to a car metaphor, but like, you're both in agreement that the key goes in the ignition of that car, but the engine's not going to turn over for everybody with just importance alone, right? So I throw that out there because if you're able to even just play or practice with engaging motivation in different ways than we've thought of before, it can really make the difference. And has the potential for a student to really start to understand what works for them, right? Because they're not stuck in that importance loop. Can continue, Sheila.
Yeah, I want to jump in here though, just like you were saying with the spiral, that it sort of normalizes a relapse. We don't have to feel bad about this. This is normal. This is what everybody should expect.
Mhm,
I think naming these different ways to, you know, overcome the inertia, right?
mhm,
To actually start doing something, can really be helpful for students to understand where their interest comes from, right? Which one of these resonates with them? And it's not necessarily that you have to go and like gamify everything for them, but for
mhm,
them to understand, oh, it's perfectly normal that competition is the thing that sparks my motivation.
mhm,
Or it's perfectly normal that it's play, or that when I'm doing something that feels like really enjoyable, I can focus. And when I'm doing something that doesn't feel enjoyable, I have a hard time, right? And it just really normalizes that and can really help remove some of that shame so that then, the shame is no longer clouding the problem, and they might be
mhm.
able to see it a little more clearly if it even is a problem anymore, as you were saying, Andrea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say, and then it makes me think of like some students who have trouble with that importance motivation and what might happen in school to them as they get isolated and say that
Mhm.
can't go to recess, you have to sit in a quiet room and stare at a piece of paper until you get this work done. Well, I bet you what's going to happen is that paper is blank until the last 5 minutes when the adrenaline kicks in, right?
Mhm.
So how can we play with the other letters in this acronym besides just that procrastination? Or I have had it sometimes where with some students, I'm like, you procrastinate, you always get it done. The only problem is how guilty you feel about your procrastination. What if we just practice not feeling guilty about it and see what happens? Um, and that tends to be when I'm working with like older kind of college students who are a bit more responsible for themselves than maybe some of my younger students. But um, yeah, so sometimes the first time they've ever considered that, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, really mind blowing. Thank you.
Mhm. And then I think what we just said is sort of what this slide says here is that the solutions that stick and work for students, what makes them work is that they come out of their own self understanding, right? Um, when I'm working with students, I encourage as much creativity as possible. I encourage trial and error systems of like, that doesn't make sense to me, but if it makes sense to you. I had a college student I met with yesterday, and she was like, I created a system that is like working so well. I'm getting all my stuff done. And she showed it to me, and I'm like, girl, I would hate this, right? And if somebody handed this to me and said, work with this, I would say, oh, this is all wrong. Of course, this is not how you should do anything. But I had her talk me through it and explain to me like all of her systems and inner workings. And I'm like, maybe that's not like the most efficient thing in the world, but I can see how it worked with her brain. She's been crushing it. I've like loved to, I was like, I'm going to use that as an example this week. I literally told her. So yeah, I think that is my consensus on it.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that, like, when it's their idea, it's gonna stick, right? Like the
Yeah.
system you're talking about, Andrea, like even though you would be like, nope, not for me, it's working for her and it was her idea, right? So not only is it helping her get the things done, it's also empowering her,
Mhm.
right? Because nobody is going in there and be like, no, you could do this better, or you should do it this way, or whatever. It's like, wait, I came up with something that's actually working. She's got to feel so good about that, right? And what we always talk about in our coaching practice is that it's a snowball effect, right? It might not start with like this very elaborate system. It might start much smaller than that, but that first win gives them so much confidence to tackle the next thing, right? But it really all starts with just getting a really clear picture of what they want to solve, right? What their pain point is, as you were saying, Andrea. And so I know you'll talk a little bit about like how a coach does this with the student, but many of you might be able to see it kind of clearly for yourselves when you're looking at what's going on for your student. But I encourage you to stay curious and just ask them questions out of true curiosity. Don't lead them to see what is coming up from them, because you will be surprised at what they say. Like it would be something that you never would have considered. It might not be an obstacle for you, but it really is for them. And when you can help them really see that problem clearly, they almost always know exactly how to tackle it, right? It's just that they can't see the problem, so they can't come up with a solution, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes
Or
just
they've
opening up that mirror
never
is really helpful.
or they've never been asked those questions before. It hasn't even occurred to them
Yeah.
that they could do it on their own, right? Especially if rightfully so, there's been a lot of tension in the home because tests are coming up and all these things, and it feels like parents might be expecting one narrow, specific type of answer, which may or may not be true, but often that's how it feels to a student.
Mhm.
And as soon as there's a little bit of shift in perspective, and we can say, I'm not attached to the solution, maybe we're just on the same page about the outcome, right? This is what how we want to feel in the home. This is how I want to see you feeling as a student. This is kind of what I expect from your grades and what you're capable of. How can we creatively get there? And how can we let the student lead how we get there?
Right. That is such an important part of this.
Yeah.
I'll let you continue.
So I've given sort of this content directly to adult students before, and I have a little section on like tips for students that I just summarized here that maybe would be helpful to bring back to your own families. That consistent execution is more important than perfection. Um, and I think that's what that upward spiral looks like, is consistent and regular repetition. It's not a perfect line upwards. And I say that it's consistent, iteration on building the skills. It doesn't mean the solution has to be consistent, right? I think sometimes students find something that works for a long time and they think if they change that solution, they're doing something wrong. And again, if we're not stuck on the solution too much, we're allowing for change to happen and develop, consistently like reflecting and having something in place is more important than finding a process and sticking to it perfectly for the rest of your life, right? It's impossible. Which goes along with practicing flexibility and creativity in your solutions. Making sure we're also separating planning to do something and actually do something. I think a potential pitfall of some of this coaching style discussion that we're having is like, if we spend so much time over engineering the perfect system, the perfect calendar, the perfect everything, that feels in our bodies like we're doing work when really it's not. So how can you make sure both are happening? That we're not so attached again to the perfect plan that it becomes a distraction in itself, and it's the planning becomes the derailment of the bike, right? And I think you're all here because you know this already, but I speak directly to students when I say don't wait until everything's on fire to ask for help, to engage with support, to reach out to teachers and mentors and coaches when you're feeling like you're really stuck and you're drowning. And hopefully what that ends up meaning too is for students, they're reaching out to their parents before the fires start. So I know a lot of you may or may not be in that stage where your students engaging with you and agreeing that there's a problem, but even that first acknowledgement is going to be a success, and keeping that in mind too.
Thank you. And there's so much more we can say about all of these things. Of course, we want to leave a lot of time for questions. So if you do want to come back to any of these, we can. I do want to sort of double click on the planning and doing, because yes, planning, especially with like highlighters and post-it notes and, some elaborate system, can feel productive. And it's actually my favorite way to procrastinate. I call it
Yeah,
productive
guilty.
procrastination. I'm not doing the thing I need to do, but we're doing all this stuff around it. It feels really good. But on the other side of this, some students don't even know that planning is a separate thing from doing, right?
Mhm.
I work with a lot of students on writing college essays, and their doing is the plan. Right? They're just like, I'm just going to do it. And I'm like, no, no, no. We should take a step back and plan. And we have to talk about, what does a good plan look like? Right? Planning is not something that everyone inherently understands exactly. What are the elements of a good plan? How long should things take? What should my goal be for this particular assignment or this essay that I'm writing? So we talk a lot about that, just really clarifying the parameters that we need to have, a timeline, what's the goal of this essay, who's the audience you're speaking to, what are you trying to communicate? And once we clarify those things, the doing is so much easier, right? So there's a way to plan that can get in your way, and there's another way to plan. Of course, it's going to be a little different for everyone, but there's another way to plan that can make the doing so much easier, right? And
Mhm.
speed things up. So that's one thing that we like to talk about with students as well. All right, now some tips for all of you. Don't force it has become sort of like my tagline. You can't. I have an 8-year-old son, and I know that I can't force him to do anything. So as they get older and older, you really can't force them to do anything. It has to be their decision, right? Of course, you can incentivize, you can find different ways to motivate, but like really, when you're working with somebody else, it has to be on their own terms. So you trying to force it is just going to create like a power struggle that is going to probably entrench both parties further in their opposing positions. It's not actually going to make something productive happen here. And I think it's really helpful, especially as your kids are in high school, to think about redefining your role as a parent in this journey of education, right? So you're not the homework police, the college counselor, the therapist, the secretary, the butler, the chauffeur, all of those things. Sometimes you have to be some of them, but ideally, especially as we're preparing our kids to launch and go off to college, we shouldn't be all of these things, right? And sometimes you don't have the capacity when you're all busy. Sometimes it hurts the relationship. Sometimes you don't have the expertise, right? To be the thing that they might need, but you can help them understand what they do need, right? And so in that way, you are a supporter, a collaborator, a champion, a confidant, a role model for them, right? Like, again, I was saying the do as I say, not as I do thing. And I'm sure there are examples in your life that you can think about, like, oh, I'm doing this thing at work, and I definitely don't want my kid to know that I'm taking this shortcut or I'm procrastinating, because I'll never get them to change that behavior. So think about yourself and how you can step into this kind of role with your teenager, because it's going to get you a lot further in keeping that relationship strong and supporting them on their journey of change, right? And I'll show you one more thing about this. Our founder, my business partner Jay, showed me this diagram once. I'm like, oh, it's so brilliant, right? As your child is aging and maturing, the parental support should be going down and their independence should be going up. Otherwise, we get stuck here, right? And you feel like, oh my God, they can't possibly manage their own calendar, everything's going to fall apart. Well, that may be true when they're 15 or 16, but do you want that to be the case when they're 25 or 30? No, there's got to be a point where you pull out of that, right? And they're never going to learn that skill unless you start stepping back. And of course, this does not mean pull the rug out from underneath them. This means gradually step into the forest and let them, do it on their own. Right. So I wanted to share this with you as well. All right, we got just a couple more slides and then we'll go to your questions. So you can start teeing them up if you want to put them in the chat, or just preparing them in your own mind if you want to come off mute and ask. But Andrea, tell us how coaching helps.
Yeah. I don't even think we've defined like what the role of a coach is just yet. It feels like something I could talk about for an hour, but what I will do to keep it simple is in a lot of ways, I just think my role as a coach is just a mirror reflecting back to students, helping them develop and deepen their own understanding, but also simultaneously knowing exactly when to kind of nudge in one direction or another. I often feel in some instances, often there's not much that I'm telling a student that they haven't already heard from a parent. I say that across all of Signet services. If you've talked to me before, you've probably heard me say that. But there's something about a relationship that is outside of the home, that is a bit of objective, that doesn't have, sounds like a negative word, but it's not what I mean, like baggage attached to it, that can just be a little bit more free for a student than doing the same exact exercise with parents. Though my best sort of relationships with students are when parents and I are working in tandem, kind of on the same page on the same things. But the things that I would do with most students, help them set goals, understand and how to track their progress and target areas of improvement. I will help them learn and practice some key skills like breaking down a project over time, keeping that motivation up, finding it in different places and experimenting with what works. Understanding how to iterate as we need. And I think for me, that means like when we're going into a relapse situation or maintenance is feeling really tough, how are we adapting? And ultimately, the highest level of this is helping a student, know themselves better, have a clear and deep vision for their lives and kind of understand their values, how they kind of show up in the world, which is, I think, a skill that builds alongside of some of these academic executive functioning skills. They're closely tied. So we work on both in coaching.
Yeah, and I love this so much because you know, high performance athletes have individual coaches, right?
Mhm.
Um, it's not as stigmatized as of course we wish it weren't, but still like having a therapist is still stigmatized in some areas in some communities, but having a coach is not, right? Anyone could use a coach, right, to get better at whatever it is. I mean, there are business leaders who pay thousands of dollars an hour to have coaching, right, of this type. They may not be working on how do I break down a project into smaller chunks, but they are still using this sort of relational modality to help them direct their focus and discipline on areas that they want to change in their lives or in their leadership or their business or whatever it is, right? So coaching is often a really great way to help students just take a step in that direction without making them feel like, oh, I'm stupid, there's something wrong with me. And I'll tell you, they are probably already thinking that. Of course, we know it's not true, but until you help them, actually we work with a parent coaching group that taught me this. If you don't help them understand what's really going on, they're going to tell themselves a story that is far worse and far more negative and harmful to their own self-esteem and development and future goals and all of these things, right? They're going to tell themselves a really terrible story. And we know that just because someone is struggling with executive functioning or some aspect of performance that we've talked about here, it does not say anything about what kind of person they are, what their potential is, what their future looks like, how smart they are, any of these things, right? It's almost like, you've been dropped into a country where you don't speak the language. Of course, you're going to have trouble functioning there. It has nothing to do with your intelligence or capability, right? We just need to help you learn the skill so that you can function the way you need to in that context, right? So try to take that with you as you maybe introduce the idea of working with somebody on these things to your kid, or if you want to work on it with them, though that can be hard because of Andrea, as Andrea said, there's sometimes some baggage there, right? All right. So I want to tell you just a little bit about how we do it at Signet. So we do all of these things, and we're never really doing one in a silo. right? We might be working with someone on executive functioning, but we're already thinking about how can they practice this skill in their academic courses, right? And if they're really having trouble there, we might say, hey, maybe a tutor, 1 or 2 sessions, or maybe a regular weekly touch base can help you stay on track in that class, because we know high school is not just about doing the work, it's also about understanding and learning things, right? And so we, keep those two things separate, but we can still work on them together, right? And we have a number of coaches who also are subject tutors, or who also are test prep tutors, or who also are essay specialists. And so we can kind of take that understanding of an executive functioning challenge or skill that they are trying to build into these different areas that we're working on with them, so they have even more opportunities to practice and build that skill, but also to just power their performance in those areas, right? And one of the things I really love that we do that is very unique in the kind of world of tutoring and test prep is that we work with a lot of neurodiverse students on SAT and ACT prep, right? A lot of kids who have ADHD or maybe a dyslexia or processing issue think, oh, testing is never something I'm going to be good at, right? And actually our webinar next month is all about how you can also use executive functioning and some of these sort of metacognitive skills to really superpower somebody's test prep, whether they're neurodiverse or, a high performing student who is aiming for a perfect score. And, that's not a mutually exclusive set of groups, right? We've had neurodiverse students score a perfect score, because we approach it in a really specific way where we're thinking about how these executive functions are playing into their prep. And then, as I mentioned earlier, college admissions is a really complex project, and it can be very confusing, anxiety inducing. There are a lot of stakeholders, a lot of expectations, and a lot of things to get done in a relatively short amount of time. And so we work with a lot of kids who have executive function challenges in the college admissions process, because we can kind of adapt and use some of our coaching knowledge to help them get things done around admissions. So at Signet, you have this whole ecosystem of people who are working together under Andrea's really wonderful leadership to make sure every student is getting what they need, right? So you don't have to go explaining the situation to like 4 different people in order to get them through high school. You've got Andrea. Just tell her everything.
Love it.
All right, we're going to go to questions. I do want to encourage you to book a free consult. Andrea talks to clients, and we have one other colleague, Mackenzie, who is also really wonderful, talks to anyone who is interested in what we do and whether it's a fit for them. You could probably tell from this webinar, we're educators first. This is a very no pressure call. We really want to help you understand, or help understand what's going on for you and your child. And often people leave that 20-25 minute call feeling like, oh, I have such a better understanding of what's going on. I feel like I know exactly what I need to do. I can relax. I feel so much better. And they may not even sign up for any services, and that's fine. Right. So I really do want to encourage you to book a free consult. You can scan that QR code. Of course, you've got our email, so you can always email us as well. But let's pivot to questions. I left that QR code up there in case you want to scan it. I would love to hear questions. I don't see anything in the chat yet. So if you want, feel free to just raise your hand and we can take a look, call you, and you can come off mute and talk about that. While you are getting your questions ready, I know sometimes it takes a little bit of time. Andrea, I'm going to ask you a question.
Tell me.
What is the quote unquote worst situation you've ever walked into, and how did it play out?
Well, I'm thinking of not necessarily my own personal experience. I don't know, maybe I get I get myself out of some of the more complicated ones secretly. But also I think some of my coaching colleagues are really good at the more, we call them triage situations, right?
Yeah.
When we get more of an like acute situation, the stakes are extremely high. And the student is in a program, is in a class, the grades have all slipped, they're all falling behind. Oh my gosh, if we don't pull this together in the next 2 weeks, XYZ consequence is going to happen. And I think about those students, and I wish I had heard from them earlier, right? I wish we could have gotten in and intervened, but a lot of what we do in those situations is just recognize the reality of the situation and consider that maybe our idea of success has to change. Like maybe instead of trying to power through and go through all these things and experience all this emotional trauma, that this is a sign that this student needs a break, that maybe our best move is actually to take a gap year, to address mental health in a different way, to say, okay, at the end of the day, what is our goal? And it's for the student to be happy and successful in life. And forcing the square peg through the round hole in this everything's on fire situation wasn't exactly the most helpful thing. So I think that's speaking a little bit generally to be anonymous, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Well, we still don't have any audience questions, so I'm just gonna have to keep asking you questions. You're welcome to ask me one, and I can try to tackle it. But we really do want to hear your questions. We know you're here for a reason, so tell us what's on your mind. No shame. I'm gonna ask you to tell us a story of a student where everything seemed okay, and
mhm,
the grades were really high, and
mhm.
everyone was like, oh, this student's going places, they don't need any help, whatever. But as you worked with them, you were able to uncover something that did make their life easier, right?
Mm,
And maybe tell us some of the signs that, or the reasons that they brought in a coach in the first place.
yeah. I think I think a lot about that the high performing low gear student, right, who's just pedaling and pedaling and pedaling. Kind of combined with, you're saying that the post-its and the highlighters and the systems, they look so impressive, that they can really mask things that are going on beneath the surface, right? Um, so I think part of my experience is to just like, I'm not fooled very easily by those sort of external things, that the presentation and the picture that a student might be going on. Um, because I think often in those cases, we're not, they're coming to me with the binder and the post-its, and they're like, oh, what's wrong in my system? How come I'm like so stressed? And we are closing the book and we're saying, okay, no, we're gonna dig around a little bit. And often I'm actually thinking of one particular case when I was like, I know we're all here, family, parents, to say what's wrong with my system. How come I'm falling behind? How come this is so stressful? But I say, but I'm hearing that there might be some other kind of mental health challenges going on. There's a high level of anxiety that's not really rooted in things that feel very clear to me. And the combination of like actually engaging and addressing that underlying thing um, help that student ease up a little bit.
That's great. Okay, we've got some people who have to jump, and that's fine. You will get the recording tomorrow and some other really helpful information.
Mhm.
Um, I wonder if you could tell us, I know you had a student a couple years ago where his laundry pile became a really important indicator for you. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I think that's work I try to help students do, right? Is say, what's our first sign that like we're going into that relapse of the cycle, right? How can we know ourselves well enough? Like I have even in my own life, I'm saying, when I was talking to a friend about this yesterday, like when I'm going through a phase where I can't sit in silence, I always have, I like podcasts on constantly. I'm bringing it like into the shower with me because I can't sit alone with my own thoughts. I just have to play something. That's my first indicator that like my stress is quite high, and I think there's something that I need to do and
Mm.
address. And with that particular student, like when his laundry system became interrupted, that was always the first thing to go. And it was, I can't quite remember how like why that was the case for that particular student, but it was also visible in his room. He was a college student who was in a dorm. I was like, can we talk about what's going on in your background? It looks like a disaster zone in there. Um, Maybe now we need to talk about what's going on in your classes, right?
Right,
Um, so yeah, I think for some students that might have no correlation, but for him, we knew that it was.
right,
Yeah.
right. Wonderful. All right, we still don't have questions.
Okay.
We still have 4 minutes left. Do you have any questions for me, Andrea, that you hear parents asking you all the time?
Hmm. Yeah, I guess I'm curious when you're working with students in like college admissions process, um, like what are the things that you really wish got nipped in the bud before students got to you? What are the things that really get in students' way?
Yes. Oh my God, there's so many. This is a really good question.
Loaded question.
Number one, I wish they knew how they like to write, how they like to stay organized, how they like to keep track of appointments. Most of the time when I'm working with students, it seems to me that, I mean, I'm sure their parents are telling them something, but it seems to me that I'm the first person working with them that's like, okay, you need a calendar to make sure you don't miss appointments with me. How are you keeping track of this? Where is it going? Right? Because I always send invites, but that doesn't mean it makes it onto a calendar that they look at. Right? It may just be an email that they continue to ignore in their inbox. Right? So, having some knowledge of what they like to do, what's comfortable for them, or just the honesty to be like, I've never needed to do that before, but I'm interested in learning. Right. And usually parents are like trying to get in the mix with the scheduling or with the whatever. And I'm like, nope, nope. It is time for Johnny to learn how to do this for himself. Right. Um, how have I tried to find the scheduling that works for them? Well, I tell them what works for me. And I say, this works for me. I know it does not work for everybody else. You may want to have a paper calendar. You may want to have an iPhone reminder. You may want to just have a post-it note on your screen when our next appointment is, right? But I need you to have something,
Mhm.
right? Whatever it is. And then, we do what Andrew is talking about, that we try things and we see how it works, right?
Mhm.
Um, the other thing that I do with students that they don't often realize is something that might have held them back in the past. I actually just had a conversation with a mom and her daughter last week who were really just feeling so behind. And I'm like, all right, where is our map of things that need to get done? And they were like, wait, what? And I'm like, here's problem number one. It's all just kind of vague. There's all this stuff that needs to get done, right? It wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't sequenced anywhere, either by, due date or order of importance or order of enthusiasm. Nothing, right? So that's where we started. And I said, okay, tell me everything. I'm going to write it down. I'm going to put it into this spreadsheet for you. And then I'm also going to help you think about how to. So, for example, we were working on the 30 essays that she's got to write for her college applications. I helped her see that a lot of these essay prompts overlap. And of course, they all need to be unique to each college, but the part that where she's talking about herself and her goals, that's going to be pretty similar across all of those essays. So I helped her kind of talk through that and we mapped out what overlaps. But that's not where we stopped. Then we talked about priorities, right? And this one had an earlier deadline than that one, but one of them was actually a longer essay and one was a shorter essay. And I said, wait, if we do this long essay first, you will be able to condense it for this other one, right? Or this long essay is actually made up of the building blocks of these two other essays that you have to write. Maybe we write those two first because they're so much more specific. And then we figure out how to stitch them together in the longer essay. Right. And I can tell you, if there's something really acute, like it's due next week, I'm going to tell you this is what we need to do. But we have, several weeks before her deadlines. So I was like, you get to decide what that priority is. Not everything is equally important. And if we start one place, that's going to lead us to a next logical step. So where do you want to do that? Right. And that's all
Good.
executive functioning.
Which I imagine if you're getting a student to you who spent a year, 2 years already developing those skills, there's probably a lot less time you're gonna spend
Yeah.
doing all that.
And I'm happy to do that work because
Yeah.
it really does make me feel good to unlock something for them. But I know I'm not teaching them the skill, right? I'm just giving them a glimpse of my skill at that thing, right? And hopefully that's a little light bulb moment and they go chase that skill. But I also know that it reduces the stress completely. They know what to focus on. Mom and dad know what they're focused on, and mom and dad can help them focus on that thing instead of worrying about all these 20 other things that probably need to be done, but not right now. Right. And I'm very interested in reducing the stress levels in the house. So that's another reason like if selfishly for you, reduce the stress in your house before it's too late and you just have to face it head on, right?
Beautiful.
All right, we are out of time, but of course, if you have questions, you can reply to any of our emails and ask your questions, book your free consult. And I hope you'll join us next time as we talk about testing for neurodiverse kids. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks.